Good afternoon. We are in the INSS Live studio during the break in the conference, and we're going to try to tackle some of the main issues that have been discussed throughout the day with some very distinguished guests. So thank you very much for being here with me. I would like to start with Ambassador Jeffrey, and I would like to ask you, based on what we've been talking all day about the main challenges in the region, can you give us a little bit of your assessment of what those challenges are, and what can the United States do?
Well, I think from both the international participants here talking about the region as a whole, and a whole series of Israeli government officials and political figures talking about the specific situation of Israel in the region, there is a general consensus that the region is a mess.
I think so, yeah.
We start with that. That the chessboard is being knocked over right in front of our eyes. Now, the question is, what not just can the United States do about this, but what can we all do about that? Because the one thing I have learned, particularly with President Obama, but I think with most American leaders these days, if we don't have local support behind us in the international community, at least tolerant of us, we're not going to do very much. So that's the first thing.
And I think that's a really good entry point, because if we need everybody's support in this complex, messy region, I want to ask you, Gallia, what about Turkey? Where are they standing? What about Turkey and Syria? And after, if you have a little bit of time, what's happening between Turkey and Israel?
Unfortunately for Turkey, it's not only Syria. I think Turkey faces now three challenges. One is, of course, the issue of the Islamic State. The Islamic State now sees also Turkey as a target. We had recently a terrorist bombing in Istanbul against tourists. Turkey is a tourist superpower. For Turkey to have this kind of event is very problematic. This is one issue. Another issue is the resumption of the Kurdish violence in southeast Turkey. After years of peace process, we now have urban fighting inside cities in the southeast of Turkey. And that's a very big issue for Turkey. And lastly, we have the crisis between Turkey and Russia. It's happening because of Syria, but it's a big crisis. Now we had a recent poll in Turkey, and the Turkish public sees Russia as its main threat.
Wow, that is very interesting. So in the future, where do you think this is going to go?
Turkey is, it's in two continents, we know that. So it faces all the dilemmas with its European friends, with its NATO allies, and all its dilemmas with the Middle East, which, as we said, is a messy region. And in this context, you asked me about Turkey and Israel. In this context, I think this is where the normalization between Israel and Turkey can enter. Turkey also understands that it has enough problems, and if it can order up its relations with Israel, that's a good idea, especially in the context when you have struggle with Russia. You want to be in good terms with the United States, and the United States sees normalization between Turkey and Israel as its interest, and that's why one of the reasons why Turkey is now more enthusiastic about repairing its relations with Israel.
Talking about another key piece in this regional puzzle, I'm going to ask you a little bit about Iran. Because there's no question that in terms of foreign policy, in terms of power projection, Iran is one of the key players here. So tell me a little bit, Avner, what do you think are and is going to be the role of Iran in 2016 after implementation day? Where do we go from here with Iran?
So, touching a bit about the nuclear issue, I think right now everybody would like to see the agreement secured, to move forward. They just secure the implementation, and I don't see high chances for a big blatant violation. Saying that, Iran will move forward conventionally in the region with the regional policy, and it will challenge American assets and Israeli assets, and this is something we need to take care of today. And starting with a joint policy with the Americans, we need to come to some kind of understanding. Joint policy that will secure both the interests of the Israel and the United States. If I would like to suggest one thing, is to think about a parallel agreement between Israel and the United States, parallel because it will be parallel to the nuclear one. It will include the nuclear, but also the non-nuclear issues. The nuclear deal with Iran dealt only with the nuclear issue. But here we cannot separate anymore, and we need to think about how to take care of that together.
So I'm going to ask Ambassador Jeffrey, what do you think about this Israel, Iran, United States triangle? And in terms of United States interests, looking forward, what do you think are going to be the main developments in 2006? Are we going towards more of a rapprochement? Is Iran and the United States bound to a new confrontation? And how does their relationship with Israel fit into all this?
Very good question. Certainly President Obama would like to see a rapprochement with Iran, at least put it on a more rational basis so that we can discuss problems such as the sailors, such as legal questions, such as people imprisoned. But the general consensus in the United States is this is not like when Gorbachev took power in the Soviet Union and a total shift in the Soviet Union's goals and outlook on the global basis. We see, most of us, Iran as a ambitious, hegemonic regional power. It has rational actors such as President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif, who are trying to do this in a way that does not generate the sort of antagonism and countervailing force that Ahmadinejad and the Revolutionary Guards do, but their end goals are pretty much the same. Given that, to the extent that the United States still sees itself playing a key role in regional security, there's going to be confrontations and clashes because we don't support regional hegemons. That's been one of our rules ever since the Cold War. So I think that there will be a considerable conflict. With Israel, it's very interesting. It's a little bit like asking about Israel and Daesh. Daesh is an enemy of Israel's. Iran is an enemy of Israel's. But Israel isn't the number one enemy of either Daesh or Iran. It's just like 65 countries are in a coalition against Daesh, with the limited exception of the United States. Their number one concern is not Daesh, and it's why the momentum is not going. So Israel has room to maneuver in the Middle East, perhaps more than Israel has ever had before. This is fascinating, what's going on right now, and it has survived this, not quite intifada, but it has survived a breakdown, a serious breakdown and continuing breakdown in the peace process, and a very serious uptick in violence with many, many victims here in Israel. And nonetheless, this isn't having the effect it usually has in the region because things have gotten too serious and Israel is too important and powerful a player.
And if Israel is more or less stable in these games of moving pieces in the region, I would like to ask both Gallia and Avner about the respective countries they follow so closely in their daily work. In other words, how stable, what is the domestic mood in Turkey? What should we expect in terms of internal relations? Is there any big surprise that you see looming on the horizon? And then I'm going to move to Iran, but first Turkey.
Again, the Kurdish issue and the resumption of violence is a very big deal. I mean, there was a peace process. It was thought that if anybody could solve the Kurdish issue in Turkey, and we have to remember the Kurdish minority is around 20% of the Turkish population, it was Erdogan. They thought Erdogan can do this, but Erdogan understood that the Kurds are an obstacle in his wish to change the system in Turkey from a parliamentary system to a presidential system. And from then, it's been an all-out war. He's not been, and he says everybody's a traitor. Everybody who says that we should return to the peace process, including academics, including journalists, is now considered a traitor. So there's a big issue in this respect of Turkey sliding down to authoritarian lines, but it doesn't mean it's not, it's unstable. It means that it's in the wrong direction, but unfortunately it's still quite stable.
Stable, but in the wrong direction. And what about Iran? Same outlook or less stable, more change in the horizon?
We need to be very cautious here because we are talking about the Middle East. So I know two things. One is that this is not the natural regime of at least 50% of the Iranian population, which are much more pragmatic and less religious. The other thing that I know that this regime is resolved to use power and kill its own people in order to survive. Now, when the first element will overcome the second one, I don't know. But my forecast will be that it will take some time for Iran to develop this secular, moderate leadership that we all want to or wish to see in Iran.
And before that happens, are we going to have to deal with some, let's say, unlikely but necessary cooperations? And I'm going to ask you, Ambassador Jeffrey, when I think about the United States and Iran having to cooperate on fighting Daesh, for example. And I'm putting a question mark. So my question would be, can we? Should we? Is the United States going to have to cooperate with actors like Iran on issues like the rise of the Islamic State? And then we'll get to the Russian role. And again, we'll go back to this idea of a likely but necessary cooperation in a region that's so unstable.
The choice of words is very important because cooperate is what we do with Israel and Turkey. And even though this president has differences with Bibi Netanyahu and President Erdogan, we cooperate on lots of things. I think cooperate is too strong a word with Iran. I would use coordinate. We can't fight Daesh, for example, in Iraq without a certain coordination with Iran. Otherwise, Iran's tendency is to agitate the Shia elements of the society that it controls or has influence over to oppress the Sunni Arabs, who are, of course, the key population group in the fight against ISIS, and even to some degree the Kurds. So to get those Shia groups to fall off of that so that we in Iraq and the Kurds can together fight against ISIS, you have to coordinate with the Iranians. That doesn't mean we have shared values beyond the fact of eliminating ISIS. In Syria, it's much more complicated because we disagree on Assad and we disagree on Assad's role in all of the woes of the Middle East.
Which brings me to Russia. Since we're talking about the future of the Middle East and we're talking about Syria as the central piece of the puzzle, what about United States and Russian cooperation on getting to a political settlement in Syria in 2016? Is it realistic or are we not there yet?
Again, I would use U.S.-Russian coordination is not only realistic, it's absolutely essential. Just like we coordinated with Japan when it capitulated at the end of World War II. Not that I think Russia is going to capitulate, but it's clear that Russia has interests in Syria that we understand, its base. That's part of the status quo in the Middle East, like it or not. Russia has interests in the region that is aggressively pursuing that are not part of the status quo, which is to undercut the entire American-led security system in the region, to take pressure off of the Ukraine, to basically find American vulnerabilities, to find a new ally, Iran, with whom it can make mischief in the region. We can't cooperate with Russia on dealing with that problem because we're diametrically opposed. We're the two sides on the playing field. But what we can do is come up with a compromise solution if and only if there is a ceasefire in Syria that holds. That will only happen if there is a stalemate on the battlefield. Stalemate on the battlefield can lead to a ceasefire, can lead to an agreed minimum win-win solution. Absent a stalemate on the battlefield, and if America doesn't take steps to ensure that there will be a stalemate, Russia, Assad, and the Iranians are going to push for a military victory.
And do you think Turkey is going to go along with this? Very briefly, because we're running short of time, but I had to ask you.
I think the crisis with Russia is pushing Turkey to NATO, and it's going to be more cooperative in the fight against the Islamic State. It's not going to be perfect. It has its own set of calculations, but it's going to be a better, more loyal ally than it was before.
Right. So much to discuss, and we're just started to touch, on the main issues that are really affecting our very complex and dynamic region. Well, let me just thank you all for chatting here with me and telling me a little bit about Iran, Turkey, and how the United States look at this incredibly complicated region. And now we're going to go to a little break, and soon after the conference is going to continue. So thank you very much for watching through the internet, and we'll be back soon. Thank you.